I'm going to show you how to use REST and Orchestrator. Let's get started. Hi everyone, I'm Watrous from VVork. If this is your first time here and you want to learn about automating, programming, and monitoring in VMware environments, you're in the right place. This is part 10 in a 10-part video series in which we're exploring how to make REST API calls. Here in part 10, we're going to be looking specifically at Orchestrator. In earlier videos, I talked with you about what are known in the REST world as path parameters and query parameters. We can use those in the world of Orchestrator too when we use the REST plugin. So let me show you what I'm talking about in the lab environment. All right, as you can see, I'm back in Postman. I'd like to remind you of a REST server that we used in an earlier video and that we're going to use as an example in this one. This is a REST server that resides at restapixample.com. It basically acts as a database of employee record information, and it has operations such as this first one called get all employees. If we run this operation, it's going to return information about all the employees in JSON formatted data. So let's go ahead and do it. We'll click send, and we got back at 200, which is good. And as you can see, we have information about multiple employees here. For each employee, we see what their name is, what their salary is, and so forth. In addition, we also have a separate ID assigned to each employee. Let's call that the employee ID. Now with this same REST server, if you do a slightly different REST operation, you can look up a single employee. The URL is very similar to the one that we just saw, but notice now instead of employees, the endpoint URL here ends in employee, singular, followed by a number. In this case here, this is a path parameter. Path parameters show up in the path of the URL. A slightly different approach that you'll sometimes see used looks more like this. When you see the question mark, that's a query parameter. But for our purposes right now, let's not worry about the difference between a path parameter and a query parameter. So as we just saw, this is a endpoint URL for an operation that will look up information about an employee. But notice that we've hard-coded the specific employee ID. This is always going to look up whoever is employee number 20. That's fine. We can run this. If I click send, whoops, before we run this, I see that I made a little typo here. Looking up a single employee, the API documentation says the URL is employee, singular, followed by the employee ID. If we hit send, you'll notice that we get back information about this one employee called Rios. Now, that's fine, but that's kind of boring because we have hard-coded this value. Well, in the world of Postman, we can create a variable so that this part of the operation URL can change as needed. Now, as you can see, we can set up a variable here, but I'm actually going to go into my VVork environment directly and create my variable there. So I'm going to create a variable called employee underscore ID, and I'm going to set its value to, why don't we pick employee number 1. Remember to save. And at this point, I don't need this VVork environment open anymore, so I'll go ahead and close that. And over here in our operation, instead of hard coding the value for this particular employee, I'm going to use the variable that we just defined. And as you can see, it knows it's a variable, and it will substitute in the value 1 for the employee ID if I hit send right now. If I want to, I can go back and change the value of that variable to make this same REST operation behave a little differently. It'll look up a different user. So notice if I run this operation, if I click send, I get back a 200 code, and sure enough, here is that particular user. So again, this is all just a refresher of how this works in general and specifically how we can do things like this in Postman. But this is not a video on Postman. This is a video on Orchestrator. So let's head over to Orchestrator and see how you do the same sort of thing over here. So under Orchestrator, let me close out what I was working on here. The first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to go in and add a REST host for that REST API example server that we're just working with. So we're going to run this workflow. Let's give this REST server a name. Why don't we call it REST API example server. And we need to know the URL for all of its operations. Well, again, if we go back to Postman, we can see that all of its URLs, I could just go this far, but I'm going to, since all the URLs begin with this much of the URL, all the operations begin with this, I'm going to go ahead and copy this common portion so that when I define the operations, I only have to type this tail end. Anyways, let's go back over to Orchestrator. We'll paste in that URL. And I'm going to go with some defaults here that should work fine. This particular REST server has no need for authentication, so we'll leave that blank. We're just going to click Run. So we're adding the REST operation and is completed successfully. At this point, if we go over to the inventory and go into the REST plugin, we sure enough see our new REST server. Here it is right there. All right, so what we're going to do next is go into workflows. You know that from what we've seen in previous videos that the next logical step to take would be to run, where's it hiding? Add a REST operation. Now, I don't know if you noticed this in the earlier video, but take a look when I run this workflow at what it says in that big old descriptive paragraph. Go ahead and hit pause and take a look and see if you can make sense of what it's saying. All right, now that you've taken a look at it, essentially what we're saying here is that you can set up this operation to behave in a dynamic manner. Instead of being hard-coded to always looking up one employee, we can set up a parameter that's going to prompt the user who's running this operation. Each time they run this REST operation, it's going to ask them which employee. Or in the examples that we see here, we could set up a parameter that asks for a customer ID or a parameter that asks for a date. Any sort of information that we're passing in conditionally through the URL can be set up in Orchestrator as a parameter. Now you always know in Orchestrator when you're seeing these parameters by the presence of the single open curly brace followed by some sort of name and the closed curly brace. So the thing that's in between those curly braces is the name of the parameter. So why don't we do this in our look up a single employee example. So the first thing we're going to do here is select the REST server. So our REST server is this REST API example server that we just added. The next thing that we're going to do is give this a name. Why don't we name it similar to what I called it in Postman. So in Postman, I called it get one employee. That seems like a fine name. Why don't we call the REST operation in Orchestrator the same thing? So get one employee. I think that's the name I just read. And then we need the template URL. The template URL is this trailing portion. Let me grab that there. The trailing portion of the URL. Now you'll remember when we first started out here in Postman, it had a hard-coded ID. And why don't we go ahead and copy that in to Orchestrator. But as you know, 20 is a hard-coded value, and that's what we want to get rid of. So what we're going to do here is get rid of that hard-coded value, and we're going to create a new parameter on the fly. No need to define a variable, no need to do anything like we just did in Postman. All you have to do is type single curly brace, followed by, give it a good descriptive name like employee underscore ID, close curly, and then run the, hang on a moment before we run this workflow. You probably already caught this. I just noticed that I accidentally typed two close curly braces. So in Postman, to define a variable, in Postman you type two curly open braces and two closed curly braces. Here in Orchestrator, it's just a single open curly brace and a single closed curly brace to define your parameter. All right, let's click run. All right, so we run that workflow. It very quickly completes. We've now added a new REST operation. And as you know, that means we should now be able to go over to invoke a REST operation, run invoke a REST operation, tell it what operation we want to call. So here's our REST server, and here's the operation that we want to call. And when we click select, next thing it wants to know is, do you want to specify any accept headers like application/JSON. Strictly not necessary in this particular case, but I'll go ahead and type that. But before you hit run, did you notice we've got a new tab here? Input parameters. If you go to input parameters, notice it's asking us for that employee ID. So if I type something such as employee ID number 1 and I click run, the URL gets dynamically changed, so we're looking up that particular employee. And if we go to the logs, here is again the employee record for employee number 1. Good old Tiger Nixon, whoever that is. So you have now seen in this particular instance me using a parameter in the REST plugin in Orchestrator to implement a path parameter in our REST operation endpoint URL. This same technique of creating a parameter in Orchestrator will also work for REST query parameters. Remember, those are the ones that say question mark something equals something. So this parameter mechanism in Orchestrator is flexible. It handles both path parameters and query parameters. There's one last thing I'll show you here before we close up this video. Outside of the REST configuration workflows, in fact, outside of this workflow folder called REST HTTP, there is another folder supplied by the very same REST plugin, a workflow folder called http-rest-samples. And as you might guess from the name, there's a bunch of interesting samples here that you can work with. But I'd like to point out here that invoke a dynamic REST operation is very similar to the process that we just went through. So I'll leave it to you, the viewer, to explore this workflow on your own. Join me in the next video as we continue our exploration into REST and Orchestrator.